ever since this movie came out, I've had so many requests to review Tron Legacy, but I realized that in order to do that, I would probably have to sit down and watch the first Tron, which I've never seen. It didn't look very interesting to me even as a kid, and I never really bothered with it. So a couple of days ago, I sat down and I watched both of these films back to back. So in addition to this being a review of Tron Legacy, you can also take this as being sort of a micro review of the first film, which I don't really have that much to say about. To tell you the truth, in all honesty, with apologies to all the Tron fans out there, I didn't think that either of these films were very good. They weren't terrible, they just weren't very good. And the first film, I'm sure it was very state-of-the-art for its time, and obviously I wasn't sitting there going, oh my god, that looks so fake, because it was the 80s, and in the 80s, I'm sure this all looked amazing. And the second film, obviously, it is up with the times, and the special effects were good, just as good for today as those effects were for the 80s. But the problem that both of these films have are the freaking stories. And it has a very unique problem, though, in that I thought that the idea behind both of these films were actually pretty interesting. The first film, pretty much, both of these films have kind of a religious or at least philosophical subtext. The first film especially had a big, deep-rooted religious context. This kind of has an Eastern philosophical sort of subtext to it. And I liked the idea in the first movie of this program kind of becoming bigger than it was ever supposed to be and even outsmarting its original user. And in the second film, I really like the idea, and I guess I'll go from there because this is a review of Tron Legacy, and I guess I'll start talking about that movie exclusively. Basically what happens is the dude from the first movie, he took over a business, a computer business or a video game business or what have you, and he keeps on, it turns out that he keeps on going back and forth between the real world and the computer world, and one day he disappears supposedly to go to work and he never comes back. Well, it turns out that he got trapped in the computer world, and what he was trying to do in there is make this perfect world. And in doing so, he created this program that was designed specifically for that task of creating a perfect world. Well, eventually something happened that got really convoluted and confusing, but I'll go into that later, to where the program inadvertently created a new life form. And he's like, oh, okay, well, this is great, this is wonderful, we created this new life form, this is amazing, but the program that he created in order to make this a perfect world saw that new life form as an imperfection, and he wiped him out, and he took over the system, and he was working against the person who originally programmed him because he's not making this world perfect anymore. That's a very interesting idea, and it's a good conflict, and the core idea of this film was good, but by God Almighty, they just could not work that into a feasible story. It's the story of both of these films, but I'm going to stick with this one. It is the story of Tron Legacy that really brings it down. On paper, everything that I just described is a really good idea for a potential story, but in practice, they just could not write this in a way that wasn't completely convoluted. And the structure of this film, and I did feel this way about the first film as well, the structure is just all over the map. They start things too early and they get out of things too late. And it's really hard for me to come up with an example of what I'm talking about. You probably just have to see the movie for yourself, because I saw this a couple of days ago, and it's very difficult for me to even remember the sequence of events that led up to the end of that movie. It's all over the map. My problem with the story is that nothing is very well defined, and nothing is very well explained. For example, the new life form that was created, I suppose inadvertently, we get told about this in a very brief exposition that doesn't really explain itself enough. The new life form is they're called the ISOs, or like isomorphs. They call them the ISOs. And I suppose what happened was He basically just said the conditions were right and these things were created. And then he goes on about how this is going to change the world and it's going to challenge the notions of religion and philosophy and science. And I'm thinking, how? I mean, what is it specifically about these ISOs other than the fact that they materialized apparently out of nothing that's going to challenge this? That they didn't do enough to distinguish the ISOs from the programs or from the humans. I don't know how they differed. There's one ISO in the movie, and it is absolutely no different from the rest of the programs. So I suppose it's just the circumstances that created them that makes them unique and that's going to challenge all of this stuff. But it didn't do enough to really tackle that issue. I also, and maybe this is just me, and keep in mind, I didn't grow up with the Tron movie. I've only seen it once. It's not something that really rooted itself in my development the way other movies have. So I'm not 100% on this. And you guys, you Tron fans out there probably know better than I. But Jeff Bridges' character in the second movie, the real one, the real old one, I didn't think that he matched the first character. And I didn't really feel that Clue, which is the name of his, essentially, the double that he created, I didn't think that he matched the character of the first one either. It kind of felt, this really felt like a completely different movie with completely different characters. And the Clue character, he presented a little bit of personality, but not enough. And the older Jeff Bridges didn't demonstrate any personality at all. And his son was completely underdeveloped. The only character that had any kind of personality in this movie was the dude with the cane that they eventually seek out for help and guidance and whatnot. That was really the only part of the movie where I was like, oh, hey, look, they put a kind of a neat person in here. They didn't go anywhere with that as far as I was concerned. And the girl in this movie, Dr. 13 from House, is basically, for all intents and purposes, just dead air. She's there to look good, and she's not my type. So that had nothing for me. It eventually just ended up being another one of those stock journey pictures that I was talking about in my review of AI. Basically, all that happens is the kid goes into the computer world, finds his dad, and he and the dad go to this other place, and then the movie ends. With very little happening in between, and it's then that you start to realize that for as good as a core idea that this movie had, I mean, it basically, the special effects just take over very, very quickly, and it never really materializes as a story. That goes without saying at this point that is my biggest issue with both of these films. It's my biggest issue with most films that I don't like, but here especially, about the only thing that I can say for it is, you know, this for what they were, the special effects were good, and if you like special effects and only special effects, you're probably going to like this movie. There's just not very much meat to it. Very quickly, I wanted to address something that happened in the end, and all of my reviews pretty much are just spoiler alerts anyway, but I guess I'll just go ahead and warn you that I'm about to tell you what happened in the end. The original Jeff Bridges and Clue kind of have a bit of a standoff, and Clue is trying to get to this portal so that he can release himself into the other world, because he wants to make that world, our world, perfect as well. What happens is he almost gets to the portal, but right at the last second, Jeff Bridges does this big, like, sonic boom move where he sucks him in and, I guess, like, dematerializes both Clue and himself, and he destroys himself in the process of destroying Clue. There are a few people who have said that that's a plot hole, because why didn't he ever do this in the rest of the film? To be fair to the movie, I don't think that was a plot hole, because they had mentioned earlier in the film that he could have done that anytime he wanted, but destroying Clue would mean destroying himself, and that's why he hadn't been doing it this whole time. And I suppose at the tail end of the movie he made the decision to kill himself to save everybody else. So that's the way I saw it. A lot of people seem to be bothered by that, and I wasn't. what I was bothered by was the fact that it was made clear in this movie that Clue he's making this big, huge army to take into the other world, and they're like, oh, we have to stop Clue, he's going to go into our world, and he's going to purge our world like he purged the ISOs, and I'm thinking, you're going to have 100 billion programs who, when they get to the other world, they're going to be squeezed into this tiny little room, and they're probably just going to suffocate to death, because when they come out into his basement office, and that's like 6,000 programs squeezed into a little clown car. I didn't know what he was planning to do when he got to our world, other than just suffocate to death. Another thing that I absolutely have to comment on, because, as I've said before, good special effects don't equal a good movie, and by that same logic, bad special effects don't equal a bad movie, always. And so I say this with a bit of hesitation. I'm only bringing it up because it's noticeable. It doesn't really affect the movie either way, but this has probably the most conspicuously fake CG rendered face I've ever seen in my life, because they use the young Jeff Bridges character in the movie often, but obviously old Jeff Bridges does not have the face that young Jeff Bridges once had. So they manipulate the face to make him look younger, and it's at best occasionally mildly convincing, and sometimes it was just downright embarrassing. I would really have thought twice before opening the film with that effect, because it looked like a high-end PS3 game, which is fine for a PS3, but it's not fine for a movie. I kept on having heavy rain flashbacks, which again is fine for a video game. Not really fine for this. But I also didn't understand the consistency of using that effect. I suppose maybe because it's expensive. And I don't want to knock anybody's work, because a lot of people obviously worked really, really hard to get that young Jeff Bridges to look as well as it possibly can, and maybe that's the best they could do. I'm just saying it didn't look very good. But they CG'd his face in order to make him look younger, to use him as a character throughout the whole film. And it's not so bad in the computer world, because at that point everything looks like a special effect anyway, and it wasn't that conspicuous. But to use that in the opening in the real world was just ridiculous. What I don't understand is that there's also a young version of another character from the first movie who in the computer world was Tron, who the actual title of the film. And they use a CG rendered version of that actor's face to make him look younger, but it's very far away, and it's very brief, and the majority of the time that we see Tron in this movie, he's covered completely by a mask. So I don't understand why they felt so confident that they could use a CG Jeff Bridges as often as they do in this film, but not the other actor. And it becomes kind of silly, where at one point, the older Jeff Bridges, he sees this nondescript guy in a full body suit and mask, which everybody is wearing in this movie, and he goes, "Oh my god, it's Tron!" I'm like, how the fuck do you know? He looks like every other guy in this movie with a damn mask. That didn't make any sense to me. This movie ends with about 5 or 6 big questions just hanging in midair, and not the whole, why didn't he ever use the little, suck the younger Jeff Bridges in, anytime he wanted. That didn't bother me, because I think they established that earlier in the movie. The whole thing basically just kind of puts the brakes on the movie in the end. There's no resolution here. And maybe that was a throwback to the first movie, because the first movie didn't really have an ending either. It just kind of stopped, and everyone was like, I guess we'll just go home. So I don't really know what else to say about this. I didn't really like the first movie very much. I didn't think the second movie was much better or much worse than the first as far as storytelling goes. If you like special effects, maybe this would be worth your time as a rental or to watch free on Netflix. I'm sure they'll be putting it up there for free at some point. I have no plans to ever see this again. I wasn't a Tron fan before I saw both of these movies. I wasn't that interested. I'm certainly not a Tron fan now. And if they make another movie, maybe I'll see it when it comes out on DVD and I'll review it for you guys. But as it stands, it just left me cold.